So, as you are probably by now all aware, if you weren't already, the world is facing large global challenges, and we need to drastically rethink the way that we design our places, our governance, and our idea of value creation. How can architects and designers contribute to solving the big issues and to help sustain a world that is shaped by and for humans? Based on his extensive portfolio of unusual projects and initiatives, our next speaker, Indy Johar, will share his thoughts on what needs to be done to stay human in a still flourishing world. Indy Johar is an architect. He is Graham Willis Professor at the University of Sheffield School of Architecture, and over the course of the last 15 years he has co-founded and established an award-winning architecture practice called Architecture 00. Indy is a teacher and writer, as well as an entrepreneur, and that's entrepreneur in the British or the English sense, not an entrepreneur, which is someone who builds buildings. He has founded several social startups and accelerators and several impact hubs in the UK, along with supporting the development of a number of open source manufacturing ventures in London, from OpenDesk to WikiHouse, and most recently DarkMatter Laboratories. He is a Young Foundation Senior Innovation Associate and an EU Startup Ambassador. Please welcome Indy Johar.
Hello. Good afternoon. So I'm between you and some rest and food after hearing so many extraordinary speakers. I think it's been an amazing day, and we've heard some amazing speakers, and actually I'm quite fortunate to follow Maria, because I think I'm going to build quite directly on this conversation. I do think we're in a transformational period, a real structural change in the way we see our cities and the way we see our places. A little bit about the studio. Studio is part of 00. We were formed in 2004 by David Saxby and myself. We've done lots of stuff, but I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about is what the need is and what the challenge is. The need. Maria accurately pointed out, and very eloquently pointed out, that actually we're living in a real structural transformation. The level of inequality that we're seeing around the world is actually growing, and also simultaneously that what you see on one side is effectively the global wealth distribution, and the other side you see what is called the Branko-Milanovic elephant curve. Elephant curve describes actually the distribution of the wealth of globalization and how it's been distributed. And quite unusually what you see here, the bottom, is where the tusks are, is where actually the benefits of globalization haven't been distributed to the developed economy middle classes and the lower middle classes. So the world paradigm that you're seeing of Brexit, Trump, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Italy, I could just keep going, they're all part of the same phenomena. They're all part of the same phenomena of how we deal with the structural transformation of our economies and our places, and how do we do that justly. At the same time, we're seeing a world like this. And 2018 was far worse. I think, we have to put in context the period of which we are responsible, all of us. This is the period to which we are responsible. And then put this into context. Less than 4% of the world's mammals, 4%, are wild. All the zebras, all the nice little giraffes that you think about, everything, 4%. Not 14, not 40%, 4%. We have 56 billion cattle in the world. And that's been the transformation. 60% wipeout. So when you're talking about the world that we've lived in over the last 30 to 40 years, actually it's been a massively destructive world to the sustainability of us. And that's the land geography of this world. The big yellow thing, that's cows. it's just worth materializing these realities. And climate change is no longer a myth on the other side of the world, and we see pictures of it in stats and people stand on front of stages. That's the financial reality as well. After Medicare and social care, actually flooding now is the third highest financial risk in the American portfolio. Keep going. We're seeing a fundamental transformation of our economies from tangible to intangible goods. Why is that important? And I think this is in that transition, we've seen this. Land, for all this talk of unicorns, of startups and everything else, where has value really been captured? Land. Land. Houses. That is where value is really stored. Look at where land value has been. It's not been in the unicorns. They've been marginal to the economy. It is land which has stored value. And then look at the transformation. You're looking at effectively, this is a stat, about 290 billion pounds being taken off, dollars being taken off the UK wage narratives as a result of automation. And Brexit and Trump and all these things are also about dealing with a paradigm where human capital becomes less valuable in the current economic model. Right? It's another way of looking at the problem. You shut your gates when you think actually human capital is no longer a surplus, is not valuable, it's less valuable. Because you're going to use capital, money, to drive automation. UK productivity was almost entirely linked with actually the growth of demographic population. So what in that world does it look like? At the same time, we've got the fourth industrial revolution going on, where actually what we're seeing is quite a remarkable thing, where we're seeing actually production look more and more like the craft economy, decentralized, distributed production. If you go to places like Vietnam, which we're working with the government, what are they saying? They're saying they're worried about reshoring. Businesses that were actually producing in Vietnam, taking their production back in automated facilities, back into Europe and other infrastructures. What they're seeing is actually the change of production modality. So in that world of kind of rising nationalism, global threats which we don't know how to deal with, automation, all these things, these are all parts of a kind of the same pattern. Is it climate breakdown or is it civilization breakdown? And in a way, the worst thing about it is we are isolated from it, so we don't perceive it in our day-to-day existence. It's like a slow, incremental. You've heard the story about the frogs, right? If you put frogs in a bowl of water, into water, and you slowly turn up the heat, they just die. They forget to jump out. Whereas if you put a frog in hot water, it jumps straight out. We don't feel it happening. But the scale of transformation is substantial. Whereas logistics, the current predictions are in the next 10 years, we're going to see a massive transformation of our logistics economy, which is about 15% of our workforce. Management, actually, what did Uber dislocate? Uber didn't destroy the taxi driver, it destroyed the taxi office. Yet we're still building our economy based on managerialism. The future of our cities will be about not post-industrial cities, post-managerial cities. All of these things are on the table in some fashion or another. Nutrients, I often talk about this. Actually, what we're seeing is a systemic decline in our food nutrients to the point where actually we're expected to see cognitive stunting of up to 20 IQ points around the world. What does that do? 20 IQ points is the distance between a scientist and not a scientist. And that's as a result of actually nutrition decline due to climate change and soil erosion. At the same time, we live in a world of absurdities. So as the world burns, we hunt for unicorns. We hunt for myths. And the other side, there's other absurdities, equally as good. We talk about social investment as being the paradigm that's going to save the world. Well, do you see the big circle over there? That's the UK's welfare budget. It's about 200 billion a year. Do you You see that little dot over there? That's the biggest social investment fund in the world. So what you start to see is a challenge in the nature of, are we moving at the scale of the problem, or are we moving at the scale of the illusion, the rhetoric of the discourse? The actual problem is that. So when we start to think about this future, how do we start to play it out? Now, one of the things we recognize about social goods and social civic assets and civic goods is that they create value which distributes. And what I want to talk to you about today in the next 20 minutes is 3 foundational shifts that for me are going to be absolutely the core of transitioning not only our environments, but actually, I think, changing the nature of design in some fashion. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this slide to move. 1, the name of your conference, Staying Human. I think being human and humane, I think, is about to be reimagined. Our thesis of being human is outdated. In fact, the policy and the science of being human is actually far in advance of actually our policy and our conceptions of it. What do I mean by that? So, we already know in terms of science, the impacts of poverty, right, affects 2 generations down the line genetically. Genetically. So this was the Dutch famine, and actually the impacts of the Dutch famine fell 2 generations down the line. It transmits genetically, the impacts of poverty. We already know scarcity, financial scarcity, any one of us deteriorates our IQ. So if you're living in poverty, actually your ability to make decisions, as Maria was rightly saying, is actually profoundly challenged. Any one of us is susceptible to that. Actually, we also know that every one of you, any one of us, is actually, more than 80% of us is not even human. It's a biological, we are living in a multitude of other organisms in deep symbiosis with us. But that also goes beyond us. Our brain is not here, our brain is equally in our gut, but it also goes that my brain is not even here. The brain is indefinitely social. It is a social product. Right, you know when your mum used to say, don't play around with those friends, they will infect you? Well, actually she's true. She was right. So the cognitive patterns of your peers influence the cognitive patterns of your brain. We are no longer discrete Leonardo da Vinci, Vitruvian man people. We are not individuals. This has been the great paradigm illusion that we've operated in. And this goes all the way through to the impacts of emotional violence, all the way through to actually issues like molecular violence. This is the brilliant work of Dr. David R. Williams in Harvard, who talks about the impacts of racism in America. And his 10-year longitudinal study, what he looked at was actually why were black Americans who were equally well educated to their peers dying 10 years in advance. What did he find? It was everyday micro-violence. The violence wasn't physical, nobody hit people on the head. It was to do with actually micro-abuse, how you were treated every day. And what that did was drove cortisone levels into your bloodstream, raised your cortisone levels. And by raising your cortisone levels, you become more susceptible to heart disease, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, which means people are dying as a result of that micro-violence 10 years in advance of people. So if I said to this half of the room, hey guys, I'm really sorry, I'm going to take 10 years, do you mind? The problem is we now know the science behind this. And so when we talk about actually civil justice, this isn't an emotive debate anymore. It is a scientific debate. It's a debate about actually how we perceive what it means to be human. So in this reality, we are multitudes. We're not divisible as the individual. In this reality, Actually, when being alone is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, loneliness has the same effect as 15 cigarettes a day. How do you start to deal with change? When actually we're not divisible from our ancestors. And actually the poverty of our ancestors impinges on today. What is justice? What is equality? What is an equal test? What is meritocracy? The reality is we're deeply entangled, not only to ourselves as individuals, as groups, but also to our biosystems. So you know, obviously, the microbiome around us is fundamentally relatable to our actually intellectual capabilities and our health. In fact, there's been increasingly lots of research going on about the impacts of microbiomes into the numbers of cancers children are having. So our biological systems actually fundamentally dictate our well-being and our cognitive performance. We are no longer isolatable in that mythic sense of being able to parcel ourselves off into a nice little home and lock away the key. So if we are they and we are interdependent, how do we start to think about change? How do we start to think about what it means to be human? And why I bring this forward is, I think, this. Every age has reinvented what it means to be human. And unless you can reinvent what it means to be human, I don't think you can actually reimagine what it means to be in the city. Our conception of being human is still locked to the idea of the individual. It's still locked to the idea of actually putting things in vitro, which is a brilliant idea of the 15th century, right? The idea of how you saw the world. So if you take a child born in the West versus a child born in the East, and you show them a painting, the child born in the East describes the context, and if asked again, describes the object. Child born in the West describes the object, and if asked again, describes the context. It's a fundamental paradigm of how we see the world. And I think the paradigm is coming to an end. The idea of the object, the idea of the isolatable individual. It was brilliant in a small world future, where the world was, in an infinite world future, where the world was infinite, perceptibly infinite, but in a small world, where the interdependencies become visible and paramount, actually it becomes a different type of conversation. And our externalities are no longer ignorable. So, what is the city in that reality? What is our vision? I think becomes a really interesting question. Second, if we acknowledge this fact of interdependency, how do we do change? How do we design change? The other part of the problem with the individual is this. We often have people talking about climate change, and then we often have politicians, your ones are very good, our ones aren't yet quite up to the standard. So we had Michael Gove turn around and said he wanted to ban plastic straws. The IPCC report has said basically we have 12 years. Plastic straws are great, but in 12 years, we are in trouble. And if the best effort a politician can make is to talk about banning straws, you know we have a problem. Because the straw is visible, right? It impacts, you can think about it. He's banning the idea of plastic in our heads. He's not banning the reality of it. So he's working in the notion of the object. So the question is, how do we deal with this? Now, I want to put this diagram forward and hopefully you can see it. Often as designers, we like to think this is a problem, this is a solution, this is the intervention, here's a building which solves it. This is a piece of work done by the UK Cabinet Office, which shows actually all the drivers of obesity. What you realize is there isn't one. It's 40, it's 50. It's a system of drivers. How do you drive change in that world? What does an intervention look like in that world is our problem. And it goes further. When you start to look at that world, right, so it's a piece of work we were doing in Dubai, they asked us to look at food waste. You know the usual story, have a look at food waste for us. Yeah, sure. And you go to say, well, restaurants, we want to recycle the restaurants. Said, we'll do a systems map. All right, we did it. We said, well, you know what? If you really want to do something about food waste, Do you know what you should do? Turn Dubai vegan. Because actually, if you want to look at the real issue, it's actually the carbon production as a result of dairy and our meat industry, which is actually one of the biggest strategic issues. So when you look at systems from a system lens, you solve different problems. You don't do the cute little thing about going to a restaurant, recycling their food waste, because we know that's not the problem. The problem is much more substantial, and that's still a design problem. How do you take a city and transform it to actually becoming vegan is itself a design problem which involves different forms of challenges. How do you recognize the reality of actually our urban environment when you know air pollution, for example, takes off a year's worth of education of children? A year's worth of education. Noise pollution, if you live next to a noisy road, you're more likely to die as a result of heart disease and stress because of ambient noise levels. What do? If in this room, I think the carbon dioxide levels are pretty high and going nicely higher, your cognitive performance is declining. I know that. Actually, we all know that. So how do you design change in this world is the problem. And we've too often been used to thinking about change from the medium level. I am an architect, so I will do buildings. I'm a policy designer, so I will do policy. I will do this part or that part of the problem. Actually, design increasingly requires a different challenge. Again, a piece of work that we're doing in Dubai, what you realize is every one of those blue dots is a government service or a government agency. If you wanted to design the change that they wanted, you need design across all those different agencies, not one service, not one paradigm. That was about reducing the time it takes to go and live in Dubai and get your kids into school. So it's no longer about service design, it's about designing at the system scale across multiple organizations. And it involves many, many skills, all the way from looking at the business model, the contracting architecture. I know it's boring, but this stuff becomes very, very important. So, increasingly what we talk about is design as being a diagonal discipline, which goes from services to policy regulation to supply chains. So if we want to think about change, you have to think about design at a system scale. And that requires not one solution, but a myriad of solutions and interventions. Again, a brilliant piece of work that we're doing with Imi Kaur in radical childcare in Birmingham. Again, you look at not one intervention. How do you do 20? How do you do 40? How do you build the civic movements of this story? So, we have to reimagine what it means to be human, I think is the first project. Second, we have to change the paradigm of design from designing objects, both metaphorical as well as real, to actually designing change in systems. The third thing for me is about designing the dark matter, or the institutional infrastructure. So, for example, we all know that urban forests are brilliant things, they're useful things. Yet in Sheffield, I believe, the city council was very actively going around cutting out trees, but because the cost of maintaining trees was actually a real liability. Yeah, genuinely, that's what the council was doing, cutting off trees. Yet we know the impact of them in terms of health, air pollution, are massive. Why was that? Well, the tree was seen as a liability on the financial books. So there's a project that we're in discussions with in a city in Europe where they're saying, can we replace £1.5 billion of rainwater sewage with 600 micro-sustainable urban drainage schemes, which are all about microforests throughout the whole city? What's the real design challenge? We know it's a better idea, you can do it. The design challenge is, how do you make a tree a virtual asset? How do you make a tree? How do you procure 600 microplots? How do you make a sustainable business model, a virtual business model around the tree? That's become the design challenge. Actually, as designers, we know what the right solution is, but it's all at the contractual and infrastructure level. Same thing, Camden High Line. You all probably know the New York High Line, right? So the New York High Line was an incredible success, but the untold story of the New York High Line was that actually it generated, for one block adjacent to it, every piece of property adjacent to it went up nearly 3 to 4 times in value. So that common piece of architecture, good, created massive amounts of private value, which was never returned back to actually the common goods. So if we want to build common goods, we know common goods create private value. How do we rebuild a new relationship around that? If we want to look at the impacts of unused properties, actually we know unused properties depress values. If we know that the impacts of healthcare costs on housing, from poor quality housing, is substantial. When we know, actually we can map actually looking at future social costs of actually reoffending rates. There's a project in Chicago where we look at actually what is the cost of somebody in America who goes to prison is about $138,000 a year to go to prison. $138,000 a year. In the UK, it's £78,000. And if you go to a very high secure young offenders prison, it is about £238,000 a year. To go to Eton is £65,000. To go to Yale is about $70,000, right? So we know we're investing. Someone who's homeless in pretty much all of Northern Europe is about £38,000 a year to your health services. £38,000 in that broad region. It is cheaper to give them a house, although we know it's not the house, that's the only problem. It's healthcare support and other things as part of it. But actually there's a whole issue of how we perceive housing, how we perceive these goods. So when you start to look at these future accounting infrastructures, looking at future social costs, you can actually design different things. And design different things more fundamentally. Again, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to keep. So when we start to look at these futures, what I'm suggesting is that there's some really interesting opportunities on the table. So you can start to look at, as Maria was rightly eloquating, how do you separate land from property value? How many of you own a house? Put your hands up. Come on, hands up. Right. How many of your houses have gone up in value in the last 10 years? Right, okay, great. So all of you put your hands up. So if I took your house and put it in the middle of Russia, would it have any value? A little bit, right? Nominal value. So what's the house really worth? Is your house gone up in value? No. What's gone up in value, your land physical land hasn't gone up in value either, because hopefully it's not agricultural grade land. So the physical land is not. What's gone up in value is here's the key words, your monopolistic access that house provides to transportation, labor markets, educational goods, all those things. Your house has not gone up in value. It's the common goods that have gone up in value. Your house is a means to capture the uplift in value that those common goods create. So we've massively created an infrastructure where people have created privatized wealth of common goods. Actually, what's interesting in technology terms is we can dismantle this property rights. Property rights, as we've imagined them, have been bundled together, where we bundle these rights together. We can unbundle them and relink them in ways that were historically not possible, because the way we designed our bureaucracy. Here's my key message. We are in an age where we're going to reinvent bureaucracy. And our administration functions have designed our property rights, have designed our rights, have designed the way we organize the city. And as those technologies allow us to change that worldview, we change the nature of the city we live in. So we change the nature of the fact we can build the High Line, but actually capture the land value using smart covenants and link them back into common goods. So churches historically had rights on the housing to help repair them. They were called covenants, certainly in the UK and other parts of the world. There was a relationship. How do you rebuild that relationship? We can suddenly do that with smart contracts distributed across all the different housing to actually recapture that value. And this is some of the stuff that we're doing in that work in London. Again, this is what I meant about digital property rights. If you debundle future development rights or current development rights, actually I can tax them differentially. Use rights can be taxed differentially. So why am I saying this? Is because this allows us to change the nature of how we make architecture and how we make the cities more equitably. And allows us to reinvent, actually, how we open up the opportunity for people to redevelop parts of London. So if you were to take the suburbia of London, you could build 300,000 homes actually in suburbia where the wealth would be distributed to Londoners as opposed to developers, entirely by changing the capacity of how we organize that. So the capacity for digital regulation, right? Digital regulation is not about taking analog to digital. It fundamentally changes the nature of regulation in more profound ways. It allows us to perhaps focus on what makes us more noble. Smart receipts isn't about smart receipts. It's about actually additive warranties, which means we can repair these things without breaking warranties. So the technology now allows a full circular repair economy to be effectively maintained in ways that we've not done before. Preventative health, actually the smartwatches many of us are wearing, actually allow us to actually build a new preventative health architecture, which has historically been very difficult to deliver. Licensing, actually licensing the city, which is some of the work that we are doing, looking at how you change the use licensing of the city, can be done real time in ways that we've never been able to imagine before. So Helsinki Restaurant Day, which is extraordinary, 40,000 people took the city of Helsinki and started to serve food everywhere. And the city politician said, can't do anything about this, look after yourselves. Extraordinary civil use of the city. Actually, we can create the infrastructures for that reality. So when we start to look at the governance and the bureaucracy of these things, I think some of the things we have to look at are actually the world that it is. A human-to-human world, how do we design actually the bureaucracy for a human-to-human world, or the governance for a human-to-human world? A human-to-rules-based world, actually a pure machine rule-based world, and actually a machine learning-based world. And there's a whole bunch of stuff I can talk about around the future of governance, which I think will be really important. So when you start to look at this stuff, I'm going to just pull this all the way through because I've literally run off the time. I want to make a point here. It is these boring things, I think, will change the nature of what we design and how we design them. Rights, policy, machine-readable policy, contracting, how we contract in many-to-many contracting models, all the way through to the licensing of that future. How we organize that, I think, will be one of the most profound things. So here's my end for 2 minutes. I think we are at a great restructuring. And as the Industrial Revolution happened in the UK in the 1750s, it happened as a result of education reform that had already happened before it. It wasn't the fact that it wasn't about technology, it was about how we reimagined our institutions. The distribution of wealth was better in the UK than Amsterdam. Education reform had already happened, right? It was those things that were foundational to the transformation. Now, in that future, I think we have to look at design from how do we create the equitable biological conditions for actually releasing the full capacity for every human to flourish. Welfare is not a cost, welfare is an investment in unlocking the capacity of every person in society. How do you create the institutional conditions for that reality? And then obviously, how do you create the technological capacities? But it opens up for me some important questions. And I think I would really encourage designers to start to re-engage with philosophy. And I think the next generation of conversations will be linked between designers, philosophers, and makers. Because I think there are big questions facing us. What is freedom in an interdependent world? How will we define that freedom? What is democracy in a post-privacy world? Anyone who talks to you about privacy is largely selling you an illusion. Because the reality is we're living in a post-privacy world. We've already jumped the gun. So the question is, how does democracy function? How does power function? How do we create society? What is agency in a predictive economy? When you can predict certain things, where is the people's freedom? What is work when we take humans beyond labor? The idea of humans no longer being agents of labor, but perhaps agents of discovery. Labor is the act which is defined by a third party. I define what your labor is. Now imagine you as agents of discovery. How do we release the full capacity of being human? Remember, every one of us here is more powerful than any general artificial intelligence that is being created or will be created for at least the next 20 to 30 years. So have we really unlocked the full capacity of every human that you know, Or are we treating them like bad robots? Command and control. So I think we are in a transformation, and the transformation needs to be focused on unlocking our humane potential in its fullest sense. But here's my last word of, I love this quote, it's from Interstellar. I think the danger we face at a moment like this is that actually we forget to look up at the stars and we forget to imagine the possible. I think in a way the future for humanity is infinite, and we mustn't forget this. And why I say this is because in the idea of the infinite future, actually there's space for all of us. Whereas actually if we define it entirely in the definition of what we have, then it's only an argument between what you have and what I have. And we divide the dirt. This is a quote, right? So we used to dream of our place in the stars, and now we fight for our place in the dirt. And the metaphor for me is that we mustn't forget the infinite possibility of being human. Because only then can we actually transcend the challenges that we really face, which is about dealing with the problems of the now. But I'm deeply hopeful that we can, by being not only staying human, but staying humane in that process. With that, I thank you.